So, when are you going to do a review podcast on the Resident Evil movies?
That's not even funny to joke about, dude. Reviewing Resident Evil games has always been a weird task. While Resident Evil is the banner series for the survival horror genre, actually comparing titles within the franchise is much like comparing apples to oranges. I recently did an overview series explaining why I love Resident Evil, and in that video I explained the different eras of Resident Evil. The original titles, from Resident Evil to Code Veronica, have little in common with the action titles from 4 to 6, while the latest titles, like 7 and Village, are unique when compared to everything else that came before in the series. Most people don't really come to Resident Evil with the expectation of Shakespearean writing. You would think that every game would be great since all that really matters is killing zombies and solving interesting puzzles. But even casual critics would tell you there is a world of difference between the best games in the series, such as 1, 2, and 4, and the worst Resident Evil games, such as Code Veronica, 0, and the absolutely travesty that was Resident Evil 6. Because they are so different, there are reasons why each Resident Evil game is loved or hated by the greater gaming community. However, as I look back upon the Resident Evil series in preparation for Resident Evil Requiem, I have noticed one particular problem that has become more and more noticeable over the years, especially in games like Resident Evil 7 and 8. What's my big problem with the Resident Evil series? Why does this problem make me nervous for Resident Evil Requiem? And why, despite their popularity and critical acclaim, will a Resident Evil title never win Game of the Year? Please join us here at Mercenary Publishing for this discussion, the biggest problem with Resident Evil. Before we go into the big problem I have with Resident Evil, I want to talk about how most modern entertainment is built around two models: roller coasters and avalanches. If you've ever attended even an introductory seminar on the art of storytelling, you would recognize the image I now have on screen. The roller coaster model is the most common model used for storytelling, and is really the models for, well, everything. Books, movies, TV shows, games. The roller coaster model is used for nearly every form of storytelling. It's even used for experience beyond the artistic mediums, but we'll get to that in a moment. The roller coaster model is more commonly used in long-form storytelling and interactive experiences. Going from left to right, it consists of a line that moves up and down. The line going up represents a coaster carriage climbing a hill, while the line going down represents the fast descent of the carriage. This cycle is repeated until the rider reaches the biggest climb in preparation for the biggest drop, the release known as the climax.
In case it wasn't immediately obvious, sex and riding a roller coaster are basically the same thing, especially when it comes to the poor bastards who get overstimulated and break down crying or puking during the middle of it.
That's a conversation for another day, so let's try not to derail the audience too much. But as Kolob suggested, the roller coaster model is used for many forms of entertainment. Build-up and anticipation, followed by revelation and release, all in preparation for the main draw, the big climb and inevitable climax. The periods of the experience where things are built up makes the drops more noticeable and enjoyable, and it also helps the audience get a preview of what they can expect when it's finally time for the big and final drop. Obviously, the three-act story is modeled after the roller coaster experience, but there are other experiences in life modeled after the roller coaster model as well. When dining out, restaurants could deliver your food all at once, but what usually happens is that the waiter comes to deliver your drinks first, then your appetizers, and finally the main course. This is designed to give you and your associates more time to converse, to savor the food, to relax and improve the overall dining experience. How does shopping work? You could buy and check out each item individually as you purchase them, but part of the fun of shopping is actually building up a cart or a bag and purchasing everything at once at the climax of the shopping experience. How does school work? Every course you take could be built around individual things you learn, but to motivate students, they are evaluated across a term, in which a collection of different subjects are bundled together, building up to the term's final evaluation. Even the best way to work out is built around this cycle. Anyone who is serious about training will tell you of the importance of warming up and slowly increasing reps and strain instead of just immediately going for the toughest workout. We are biologically built to follow the roller coaster model, which is why we see it pretty much everywhere. Build up, tension, release. Build up, tension, release. Build up, tension, climax. Why do our brains enjoy this cycle so much? To explain why, you need to understand how pleasure and dopamine actually works. Many people have the mistaken belief that dopamine is the pleasure chemical, but there's a reason why you can't just take a pill to release more dopamine and feel happy all the time. However, what scientists have found is that the most amount of dopamine is produced in pursuit and anticipation of the reward, not when the reward itself is actually obtained. The reason why we conflate the two is because we don't generally feel the dopamine release until we're in the middle of the climax. Why does winning a game with no effort feel so boring? Why do spoilers ruin stories? Why do we know something is a scam when we hear about get-rich-quick schemes? Because we are biologically engineered to care about the journey more than the destination, to borrow the phrase from Brandon Sanderson.
That's why foreplay and stamina matter so much in lovemaking. Not that you would know anything about that, huh, Anthony?
Nice try, William, but I'm not the idiot whose wife left him to join the enemy.
Low blow, you big jerk.
Don't throw stones when you live in a glass house, moron. But now that you understand the roller coaster model, we can move on and talk about the other model for life. Let's talk about how avalanches work, which is essential for understanding the weird tension when it comes to designing horror games and especially Resident Evil. Avalanches are catastrophic calamities with incredible destructive power, phenomenon that are all the more awesome because they often start with something so incredibly small. A few simple snowballs, a small break of the ice. All it takes is a simple start at the peak to produce something that can bury trees at the bottom of the hill. Other phenomenon that are similar to the avalanche include a volcano or a teapot left too long on a burner, building up unreleased tension and pressure until it can no longer be contained, resulting in a destructive burst. Whereas the roller coaster model generally has a positive correlation with entertainment and life experiences, the avalanche model generally has a negative correlation. Burnouts are avalanches. Mental breakdowns are avalanches. Market crashes are avalanches. Revolutions are avalanches. The mind can prepare and adjust without too much difficulty when life is on a roller coaster, but our biological engineering has trouble and will even break down when we feel life is like an avalanche, not an amusement park ride. In storytelling, most positive storytelling genres tend to rely on the roller coaster method. A comedy requires setup, teases, and escalations before the final punchline. A romance requires attraction, flirting, and overcoming obstacles until the lovebirds finally solidify their relationship. Action-adventure stories involve encountering and overcoming escalating problems until the final threat is dealt with. But just because the roller coaster model is more popular, and the first model taught when it comes to storytelling, doesn't mean the Avalanche model is never used. Tragedy is at the forefront of the Avalanche model, with the story constantly building up tension until the final, fated, and unavoidable collision occurs. Dramas are similar in this regard, with small, stressful problems mounting up and escalating in scale until the whole story ruptures with one explosive moment. What else tends to use the Avalanche method instead of the roller coaster method of storytelling? Horror. Horror stories traditionally use the Avalanche method because the whole point of the genre is to make the audience experience as much dread as possible before the final encounter, the climax with the monster of the story. Constantly letting out all of the tension and pressure doesn't make for as good of a horror experience, which brings us to my big problem with Resident Evil. Resident Evil, a survival horror franchise, goes back and forth on what kind of horror story it wants to tell. While many gaming developers and publishers are currently having issues making products for the dopamine-addicted TikTok generation, Capcom seems like one of the few companies who continues to enjoy nothing but success. That isn't entirely the case, as I'll outline in a video discussing Capcom's economic performance pretty soon, but it is fair to say that when it comes to making good games, few do it better than Capcom, which makes Resident Evil even more impressive when you think long and hard about it. But let's focus on Capcom for now. Video games are primarily designed around the roller coaster experience. This is because, unlike movies and TV shows, video games are rarely finished in one sitting. Many games typically take between 15 to 25 hours to beat for the first time, and that's ignoring larger games like Skyrim or Crusader Kings, where a single playthrough might take the player more than 100 hours. Live service multiplayer games are the epitome of the roller coaster experience, featuring short 15 to 30-minute matches with small relief breaks between them before players load up into the next match. This is why many video games are designed with distinct levels, because they allow for concentrated gaming experiences and good places for the player to rest, to let their mind reset before they continue with the roller coaster ride. Capcom is as successful as it is because it understands the roller coaster dopamine feedback loop. If you've never played Monster Hunter, the gameplay loop is hunting a monster, taking a break by going back to base to improve equipment, hunting tougher monsters, taking a break by going back to base to make your equipment even better, and repeating this process as you go from hunting small monsters the size of a horse to fighting giant dragons, T-Rexes, and monsters the size of a mountain. Ever played Street Fighter? Then you already know the gameplay loop. Fight a player for a few rounds or matches, then take a break to reflect upon your performance and how you can fight better. Make your adjustments in training mode or mentally, then hop back into the ring and see if you do any better. The more you improve at Street Fighter, the more exciting matches become as you take on tougher opponents, but the more time you also have to spend practicing combos, studying frame data, and stepping back from the game to prepare for these difficult matches. Mega Man? Fight one robot master in a short level, gain their weapon, then take on the other levels with a progressively growing toolset at your disposal that makes each level more complicated than the last. Devil May Cry? Start off with a simple moveset, master the main weapon you're using, but collect red orbs and other weapons from the devils you slay to grow your options and take on progressively harder challenges as you go from short level to short level. Nearly every series developed by Capcom follows this roller coaster formula because it works so well. It makes sense because our own biological system is structured around the roller coaster method of rhythmic anticipation, tension, and release. I say nearly because there is one exception to the rule that makes this series stand out from every other franchise developed by Capcom. It took a while to get here, but we can finally talk about the genius and weirdness that is the game design of Resident Evil. I genuinely believe that among the various game genres, horror games are probably the hardest to make. This is because the thematic genre is so at odds with the interactive medium. They are basically water and oil, so incompatible it's a miracle that there are any good horror video games. For example, think about how traditional horror stories build tension. A key component of Avalanche storytelling is this sense of fate, that there is nothing that can be done to change the conclusion of the story. There needs to be a sense of powerlessness, a lack of agency for horror to be effective. But video games are inherently designed around giving players as much agency and choice as possible. That's what makes playing video games so fun. But here's something else that's interesting about horror, and not just in video games. Did you know that when it comes to the most popular genres in fiction, horror tends to be much shorter on average than other genres? This is because of the Avalanche method, which horror relies on to build tension. You can only build up so much tension without release, because cracks inevitably form and leakage occurs. This is why pure horror stories, be they books or movies, are typically only half the length of other genres like fantasy and science fiction. This is especially true for video games. It is a rare thing to find a horror video game that takes more than 10 to 15 hours to beat, and in general, most of them tend to fall in the 5 to 10 hour range. Make it any longer, and things feel repetitive and drawn out. Numb out the audience too much, and they might not even feel that climax. The final release as the avalanche slams into the bottom of the hill is worth it. Yet Capcom somehow makes it work with Resident Evil. Well, mostly, but we'll get to that in a moment. Resident Evil shouldn't be as popular as it is, and yet it remains one of the best-selling and consistently critically acclaimed horror game series on the market. Sure, it has to reinvent itself every decade or so, but the fact that there are so few bad games in the Resident Evil series is outstanding, given how hard it is to make not just good, but great horror video games. Capcom does it by cheating. Capcom makes consistently good games because they're making action games with a horror aesthetic or flavor. Resident Evil isn't an Avalanche. It's really just a roller coaster with certain design choices and decorations to make you feel like you're being chased by an avalanche. Resident Evil doesn't have any strict levels, but they do have save rooms that you can visit to get you off of the mountain anytime you want. Resident Evil games feel long, but only because you don't know where you're going, which is why repeat playthroughs often take only a quarter of the time compared to the average player's first run-through. In fact, it's this feature that really distinguishes Resident Evil from more genuine horror experiences, in that most traditional horror stories are designed to be experienced only once, while Resident Evil actively invites and challenges players to replay them in hopes of getting better scores and unlocking more bonuses. Despite being the father of survival horror, Resident Evil is really just an action series pretending to be a horror story. Now, Resident Evil does a good job at playing pretend, and the first time you play Resident Evil, it really does feel like a nightmare you might not ever be able to overcome. That is what makes the genre so great, the nature of the genre now referred to as survival horror. The fun of survival horror is the unknown, the tension and fear of being able to overcome the challenges ahead of you and second-guessing yourself every step of the way. Do I kill this zombie now, or do I lose some health and save my ammo for the boss that may or may not be around the corner? But what if I eventually have to backtrack here? So do I save some of my ammo and take a few extra hits during the boss fight for when I come back? That's the tension that makes Resident Evil, especially the original games, so fun. But one of the huge problems with the series is that once you've beaten one Resident Evil game, you'll find other Resident Evil games designed in the same era to be significantly easier and, in many regards, less enjoyable. Despite not knowing what horrors await me in the other games, simply knowing how to overcome one Resident Evil makes you pretty well equipped to overcome the horror of all Resident Evil titles. Case in point for me, my first Resident Evil game was Resident Evil 1, but I gave up after a few hours because I didn't know what to do. A year later, a buddy showed me the ropes of survival horror by guiding me through Resident Evil 5. Now a survival horror expert, I went and played Resident Evil 4 after falling in love with 5, since 4 was supposed to be the best in the series. I enjoyed playing 5 more than I enjoyed playing 4. It wasn't because of the co-op either, because when me and my buddy played 6 when it came out, we both hated it. No, apart from all of the small differences between the games, the fact was that the formula for playing and beating Resident Evil was repeated too much, which is why it took a reinvention as big as Resident Evil 7 Biohazard to get everyone in the Resident Evil community back on board. Simply making something that is just a bigger, flashier, and harder version of something that came before usually has a detrimental effect on human enjoyment. The descent, the going down the hill after a big roller coaster climb is fun, but it is also stressful as well. Simply making a bigger hill without any change to the formula causes the human brain to produce less dopamine, which in itself is a net negative, while also causing the mind to experience stress at a faster rate than before, which leads to burnout, cynicism, and worst of all, disappointment. This is why Resident Evil trailed off with 0 and Code Veronica, and why Capcom had to do another reset following the release of 6, despite it being one of the best-selling games in the series.
But wait.
Gah, you're still here? I thought you would have left after how badly I insulted you.
Oh, you wounded my ego all right. But the wonderful thing about being a vampire is that I have more than one wife to pleasure me, while you sad, lonely little human, currently have none.
You don't have to rub it in, you weirdo. Now what do you want? Do you have a reason to interject? I'm more than happy to spill some of your other darker secrets to the audience, if you don't have anything relevant to say, William.
I do, and it has to do with his latest era of Resident Evil. Unlike the previous eras, Resident Evil really hasn't seen a drop-off in quality and fan reception like in past times. Yeah, the Resident Evil 3 remake was rushed out and undercooked, but Village has done great, and the Resident Evil 4 remake was even nominated for Game of the Year. What's going on?
Huh. I guess there's a reason why God make you his shadow after all. Loath as I am to admit it, Master Kolob here is right. Unlike the previous eras in Capcom's history, we aren't seeing an ebb and flow when it comes to the quality, sales, and fan reception to Resident Evil. Resident Evil is more beloved now than it ever has been in franchise history, and all indications seem to suggest that Resident Evil Requiem is going to knock it out of the park. No one should be worried that the newest Resident Evil is going to suck. And yet I am and will be nervous until the game is in my hands. Because the reason why modern Resident Evil games are so beloved is also the #1 complaint many people have about modern Resident Evil. It's the main design choice that led to the downfall of Resident Evil 6, but instead of pivoting away, Capcom has leaned even harder into it for Resident Evil Requiem. This is the biggest problem with Resident Evil. But if you want to know what it is, you'll need to wait until Kolob does his thing. Run the ad, William.
Hey there, Mercenary. Are you enjoying the great content produced by that dumbass Anthony? The best way to support the channel is by checking out our book series, The Mercenary Saga, a stylish character action story featuring vampire mercenaries working as they fight the forces of evil in this genre-blending tale. For this video, I want to promote The Mercenaries Crusade. a high fantasy novel inspired by Dark Souls, Fire Emblem, Berserk, and other fantasy stories. The evil man-devil Monkot has conquered Anorta and plagues the land with the miasma of deathless death. No one can die, but no one can grow. No one can have children. No one can have a purpose in a world that has lost all meaning. This cannot stand. And to fix the world, Heaven deploys the vampire warrior, Sky Crystal. To save the world, she'll have to bring death back to its cursed lands, all while trying to outrun the Grim Reaper chasing her. Can she do it? Can she save Anorta in the year of life she has left? Support the channel and enjoy the story of the Mercenary Saga. Back to the essay, Anthony.
Following the release of Resident Evil 6, Capcom had a problem. Sure, it sold very well, but the reviews were terrible. How well a game sells is not just based upon the reviews of the game, but the reception to the last game in the series. Resident Evil 5 sold as well as it did because everyone loved Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 6 had a huge launch in part because Resident Evil 5 was such a blast. Without some sort of major change or innovation, Resident Evil was heading for disaster. So Capcom took a break, and when they returned, they decided it was really time to put the horror back into survival horror. Resident Evil 7 was unlike every Resident Evil before in almost every way. For the first time in the mainline series, this game was going to be first-person view. The tone was much darker and more serious. The pacing was completely different in that you barely even use a gun for the first couple hours of the game. Whereas the traditional Resident Evil games were all roller coaster rides of horror, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard was the first game in the series that felt like a genuine tale of terror, an avalanche of horror as you deal with the Baker family. But you want to know the real telling sign that the nature of the game had changed? One of the subtle but important things that Resident Evil games are known for is the results screen. Capcom, with their company-focused emphasis on creating the best gameplay experiences for their players, includes a ranking system in many of their games. This is especially true for Resident Evil, which even in the original game would unlock bonuses for completing the game in a specific time and in a limited number of saves. Resident Evil 2 would introduce the S rank in the series, which would be featured in every mainline game thereafter, until Resident Evil 7. By removing the letter rankings from Resident Evil 7, subtlety shifts the priority for the player. Yes, there are stats to track and bonuses for completing the game in a certain way, but the replayability of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is quite limited compared to other games in the series. That is probably why, despite the huge success of the game to the point that it is one of Capcom's top 10 best-selling games of all time, the company decided to pivot with all Resident Evil games after. The Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes are all significantly more action-based, featuring the return of the letter ranking system, while even 7's direct sequel Village was made to be action-focused and more bonus unlocks for player replayability than almost any other title in the series. While all of these modern Resident Evil games are fun in their own way and for their own reasons, I have also found myself growing more and more concerned with each new Resident Evil game. In fact, I find myself repeating this same question over and over and over again. Who is Resident Evil for? These days, it feels like that Capcom is trying to make a Resident Evil for everyone. Modern Resident Evil games are games built to have elements to please fans, new and old. Do you love horror in Resident Evil? Resident Evil is gorier and scarier than ever before. Do you love action? You'll be killing more zombies with more efficient weapons than ever before. The stories are becoming more and more serious, but also featuring more campy lines, over-the-top villains and monsters than ever seen in franchise history. The jack of all trades is master of none, and as many gaming fans know, a game for everyone is a game for no one. Here's where the problem with modern Resident Evil started to sink in for me. I was replaying Village in hopes of getting the Platinum Trophy and unlocking all of the bonuses that can only be obtained through replaying. I was having a great time, or at least I was until I hit the House Beneviento section. When you're playing through Resident Evil Village for the first time, this is considered the best and scariest section of the game. It sucks playing through this section on replays, and the game only gets worse from there. I enjoyed getting chased by Moreau the first time around, but it was just so boring during the second playthrough, I finally got to Heisenberg's factory, and at that point, I just gave up. Despite my love for Resident Evil and my willingness to replay these games half a dozen times to get the Platinum Trophies, I couldn't even bring myself to complete Resident Evil Village a second time all the way through. This is where I realized that Capcom has a growing problem when it comes to modern Resident Evil. Is Resident Evil an action game with horror aesthetics, or a horror game with action elements? That is the question designers have to ask with every game they make, because what they're really asking is whether or not they want to make a game that follows the roller coaster model or the Avalanche model. Capcom has tried all sorts of models and variations of the formula, which is why most modern Resident Evil games feel so unique and fresh. Resident Evil 7 is the most Avalanche-style game of the modern era, and remains the most horror-focused because of it. Resident Evil 4 Remake is the height of the modern action formula, which makes it fun for action players and speedrunners, but really tests the limit of people who want a genuine survival horror experience. But how do you split the difference? How do you make a game that is both for action and horror fans, for people who prefer the slow, methodical, and tense experience provided by an Avalanche, while also making a game for people who come for action and good old zombie killing? Capcom's answer is to try and do both. Resident Evil Requiem is designed with 2 playable characters, each of which is meant to have a distinctive playstyle. Grace Ashcroft, the new female protagonist to the Resident Evil series, has her side of the game designed around providing a more horror-focused experience. Meanwhile, returning protagonist Leon S. Kennedy is meant to be the typical action hero, providing a gameplay experience for fans who want the more traditional roller coaster style experience. That should be all well and good, except I'm actually really nervous since it didn't go great the last time they did this. Resident Evil 6, one of the worst games in the series, and a title that almost killed Resident Evil. To this day, Resident Evil 6 is the worst rated mainline game in the series, being even more hated by critics than controversial titles like Resident Evil 0 and Code Veronica. There were many controversial design choices when it came to Resident Evil, but chief among them is this. Resident Evil 6 sucked because it tried to do too many things at once. This was a game with 4 different campaigns, each of which had their own style meant to appeal to a different kind of Resident Evil fan. Chris's campaign was meant to be more action-based, Leon's campaign was meant to be more horror-based, and I have no idea what Capcom was trying to do with Jake and Ada's campaigns. The wisdom holds true. A game for everyone is a game for no one, and that is why I am concerned about both Resident Evil Requiem and the future of the Resident Evil series. Who is Resident Evil for right now? Is Resident Evil for true horror fans who will probably only play through the game once and therefore want every moment to be terrifying? Is Resident Evil for the action diehards who want to slaughter zombie after zombie with very little thought? Is Resident Evil being built with speedrunners and casual players in mind, so there's not as much need for story, cutscenes, and non-standard gameplay? Or does Capcom want Resident Evil to branch out and try to become the next big multimedia IP? There's nothing wrong with experimenting. That's part of the reason why the current era of Resident Evil has gone as well as it has. Simply making the same game over and over again is the fastest way to make your audience bored, And even the worst of the modern Resident Evil games, the Resident Evil 3 Remake, is better than many other modern games on the market. But my concern remains. My concern is that Capcom is trying to have its cake and eat it too, that it really doesn't know what direction it wants to take Resident Evil. This is especially true with the return of Silent Hill, which has no issues with its core identity. While I had my fair share of problems with Silent Hill F, I have to admit that I liked it more than I liked almost every other modern Resident Evil outside of the Resident Evil 2 and 4 remakes. But even the Resident Evil 2 and 4 remakes, some of the best games that Capcom has ever made, failed to match the joy I had when I played through the Silent Hill 2 remake, and I typically like Resident Evil much more than Silent Hill. As much as I love modern Resident Evil, it's starting to feel like it's time for another shakeup, bringing us to Capcom's current dilemma. I would love to be proven wrong, but even if Grand Theft Auto 6 doesn't ship this year, I'm going to make a safe prediction. Resident Evil Requiem will not win Game of the Year at the Game Awards, no matter how good it is. Here's why. The Game of the Year goes to the game that is best in its class. It Takes Two and Astrobot are best in class in platforming adventures. Baldur's Gate 3, The Witcher 3, and Elden Ring are best in class in role-playing adventures. God of War and The Last of Us Part 2 are best in class in cinematic action adventures. So why won't Resident Evil Requiem ever win? Why hasn't any Resident Evil ever won? Because it is a game that is fundamentally at odds with itself, and that's okay. The joy of Resident Evil has always been the incongruity of it. It is a character-driven horror story with some of the campiest characters and dialogue you'll ever see in a video game. It is a beautiful series with lifelike graphics pushing the limits of the hardware. Also, you can watch burly men punch boulders in volcanoes or suplex corrupted Spanish priests. They're supposed to be horror games, and yet they're so fun to play, you forget the point of horror is to scare and terrify you. Given how Resident Evil games continue to sell, with every game since Resident Evil 7 Biohazard selling over 10 million copies, I don't think Capcom cares that none of their games have won the highly coveted Game of the Year title. But what is the future of Resident Evil? That's a strange question to ask with Resident Evil Requiem mere weeks away. But no matter how good or bad Requiem ends up being, it's a question Capcom is already asking themselves. Should future Resident Evil games lean more heavily into action, especially given the shorter attention spans of gamers who've been growing up on Roblox and Fortnite? Or is it time to step back from action once more and try to be more horror-like, with the resurgence of the Silent Hill franchise and other challengers in the survival horror game space? I don't think either answer is wrong, but my hope is that this is the end of another era for Capcom, that the hybrid approach will stop with Resident Evil Requiem. As excited as I am to play it, it does feel like a turning point for both the series, a capstone on everything that has come before. Of course, I haven't played the game either, and for all I know, Requiem may wind up being the culmination of the franchise, the best Resident Evil ever made. But even if it is, no gaming company can get away with a formula. Whatever comes next shouldn't just be another repeat of that which came before. It's a hard thing to ask, but I genuinely hope that the next Resident Evil is an even more radical reinvention of the wheel, perhaps even a reboot of the series. Until then, I look forward to talking to you all, my mercenary friends, in what will be the first big review for 2026. I look forward to talking to you all about Resident Evil Requiem.
And thank you for watching. This was an interesting video to make right before Resident Evil Requiem comes out, because it's only going to take a couple weeks for this video to either age really well or really bad. But either way, it was a ton of fun to make this essay, and some of the things I learned about how we humans experience pleasure was so interesting, I was actually inspired to cut out a part of this video so I could turn it into a video essay of its own. But back to the subject at hand, please be sure to leave a comment on what you think about the current state of Resident Evil. Do you love Resident Evil when it's more of an action game or more of a horror game? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and I look forward to chatting with you all. Otherwise, see you in the next video, Mercenary.